Hi, this is Wendy, and in this series of videos, we're going to learn how to use Thymeleaf. In this first video, I'll show you how to use model attributes to send data from your controller to your output pages. In the next video, we'll learn how to use Thymeleaf templates to display that data within your HTML code. And in the last video, we'll learn how to use form binding to access those same model attributes on your input forms too. This will come in handy when you want to do things like allow the user to edit an item rather than just adding new items. Now that we've learned how to send data from an input form into the controller, how can we send data from the controller to an output page? For example, if the user uses an HTML page with a form to search for a book by title, we would send that search input to the controller and tell the controller to look up all of the books in our database with that text in the title. Once we retrieve the list of books, we want to put that list in the response body and send the response back to the client so that the user can see the list of books all nice and formatted on an HTML page. To do this, we actually need two things. First, we need model attributes so that we can store the list of books to display on the page, and we need a Thymeleaf template page to format the list of books so that it's presentable. First, we'll talk about the model attributes, and then in the next section, we'll look at Thymeleaf. So what is a model attribute? The org.springframework.ui.model is a class whose instances are used to store attributes as key value pairs. It's actually a type of map. Recall from Java 2 that a map is a collection of key value pairs. The key value pairs you store in the model are accessible in a single request-response cycle. Attributes can be objects or they can be primitive data. The attribute's key is a string value that must be unique. In other words, it must be different from all of the other attribute keys that are currently stored in the model. And the value can be any primitive value or any kind of object. So let's look at some examples. You might have an attribute with the key numStudents, and it might have an int value for the number of students in a class. Or you might have an attribute with the key username that could have a string value representing the username of the user that's currently logged in. An attribute with the key newItem could have a value that's an entire inventory object for an inventory item that a user is adding via an HTML form. Now you can store attributes in the model object using code in your controller, generally in a handler method, and then you can access those attributes on an HTML output page. To access the model in a handler method, you just add a model parameter to your method. Spring automatically injects the model that it already has in the inversion of control container. In this example, we're adding a string object to the model. The attribute has a key of cat, and the value we're setting it to is the string object with the value Sydney. It's really important to note that the key for an attribute must always be a string value, and the key must be unique in the context of all the attributes stored in the model. For example, if you have an attribute in the model already with the key username, you can't store another one with the key username, not in the current application. Here's another example. In this example, we're constructing a book instance and setting some of its data members, and then we're adding a model attribute with the key book, and that attribute's value is the actual book instance that we've just created. So storing attributes is easy. Now, how do we access them in our output pages? To do a quick output of a model attribute, you can use the syntax shown here. You put two opening square brackets, a $sign, a set of curly braces, and then close the two sets of square brackets. Inside the curly braces is your attribute key, and this is the key of the model attribute that you're trying to access. But don't put any quotes around this key value. For example, here we're accessing the attribute that has the key cat and displaying its value inside a paragraph element. This assumes that in our controller, we must have saved some kind of object or value as an attribute with the key name cat. In the second example, we're accessing the attribute that has the key name book. Again, this assumes that in our controller, we must have constructed a book object and then stored that book object as an attribute with the key name book. When this one is displayed, it will automatically call the toString method of the book class and display the return value inside another paragraph element. In this third example, we're also accessing the same book attribute, but this time we're asking for the data stored in the book object's title member. As long as the book class follows bean law, this is exactly how you access instance members of an object. You can access any instance variable or data member of an object simply by using dot notation and then the name of the variable. So in this case, book.title or book.isbn or book.author. Now, what if you want to access form input values in your output pages? You can. The HTTP servlet request object contains a collection of all of the parameters that were sent along in the request's query string. Thymeleaf gives you access to this collection of request parameters via the implicit object called param. Note that implicit object is the term that we use in these kinds of applications for an object or instance that has already been created somewhere behind the scenes, and it generally already contains information. The param object is one such thing. This object is a map of all the request parameters as key value pairs, as you probably guessed. To access one of the request parameters in your output page, you just use the same syntax, but inside the curly braces, you put param.key, where key is the parameter name. For example, to access the parameter from the query string whose key is first name, you just say param.firstname. This therefore implies that there's a value in the request's query string called firstname, which contains the input that the user entered into the form input field that has the name set to firstname. Let's try all of this out with an exercise. Start a new project and add Spring Web, DevTools, Lombok, and Thymeleaf dependencies. Now copy your inventory bean from the previous lesson over into this project and add an index page and an output page. The index page should have a form that asks the user to enter their name. Then add a controller that maps to the root and loads the index page. Note that unless specified otherwise, assume all HTML pages from here on in go in the templates directory, and images and CSS should always go inside their respective directories inside the static directory. Now on your output page, make sure you give it a title and a heading. And in your controller, you're going to add a handler method that receives the user's input for the name field on the form. Also, construct an instance of the inventory class and give it some data for the ID, item name, and quantity, and then store that inventory object in the model. On your output page, add the code to display the inventory object as a string, and then also display the item's ID, name, and quantity separately, then display the user's name that they entered on the form. Test your application when you're done, and have a look at the page source in your browser. By the way, this whole exercise is outlined in the notes for this lesson, and of course, as always, I'll put the link to those notes in the video description. Go ahead and pause the video and try this exercise, and then resume the video, and I'll discuss the solution with you. So I've gone ahead and started the project and added some of the stuff to it. So I've got my inventory bean from the previous lesson, and I went to my index page and just added a really quick form that asks the user to enter their name. And then I added an output page, but I haven't put anything on it yet. And then I've got my main controller, and so far all I've done is just created the mapping so that I can load my index page. So in the question, it said in your controller, add a handler method that receives the user's input from the name on the form. So that means we're going to have request parameters. So what method did I use? I think because I was just testing stuff out and I used get. So I'm going to make a get mapping. And I should have also looked to see, output. That's nice and easy. What I use for this. Whatever you put on your form is totally fine. Public string, and I'm just going to call it output. Why not? And I am eventually going to return, I called my output page, shocker, output.html. But again, whatever you call yours is totally fine. So what I want to do is I want to receive the name that the user entered on the form. So I'm going to need a request param of type string, and my input field was called name. So that's what I'm using for my variable name. And since I'm also going to, in just a moment, I'm going to be using the model, I'm going to need that in there as well. Might as well put that in there. And of course, it's asking you to import the right package, which we do. So I need to now, looking at the steps in the exercise, construct an inventory instance. So inv equals new inventory. And I just make up, I think that was a long. And then we need what? An item name. So kibble, 10 kilogram tuna. And then we need a quantity. Whoops, 10 of those. And of course I need to import my inventory class. There we go. And I need to now add the inventory object to the model. So model.add attributes. So that's how you add an attribute. You just use the add attribute method. And then I make up a name for this attribute's key. So I'll call it inventory item. And I'm going to give it the inventory object that I just constructed. Now I don't need to do anything with my request param because that I can access using the param object. Now the other thing I'm going to do wasn't in the exercise, but just for fun, I'm going to add another attribute called cat, and I'm going to assign it the name of a cat. Just for fun. So I've actually added 2 attributes to my model. You didn't have to add the second one. I'm just doing that for fun. So I've added one as an inventory object called inv item, and the other is a string object, and it's under the key cat. And then it's going to load or return the view, which is my output page. So on my output page now, I need to my output because it's not really anything else. Ooh. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to display all of the things. First, I'm going to display the cat. So I do one of these, and then inside the curly braces, the name of the model attribute. No quotes there. Now, I want to display my inventory object as a string. My model attribute containing the inventory object was inv item, I believe. So what that will do is it'll go and find the model attribute with this key, which we hopefully know is this inventory object. And it's going to go and execute its toString. And the toString is going to be what ends up inside these paragraph elements. And then it said, just for fun, let's also display each individual piece of data. So inventory item dot ID, item ID, I believe it was. It has to be the instance variable name. And then I'm going to just put a space and then do the same thing again. But this time inventory item dot item name. I'm trying to remember what I called everything. And then I'm running out of space, so I'm just going to go down here. And then inventory item again. Dot quantity. If you added other fields, go ahead, display all of them. But that's all I want for now. And then the last thing I had to output was the name that the user typed in the text field. So for that one, I'm actually going to reference the params implicit object. So param dot, and my input field, if you want to check, was called name. Remember, it's the name attribute that goes to the server. So the name, so that's what I refer to here. And then close that paragraph. All right, so now I can run this project. So I'm going to localhost 8080. If I go to root, it should load my ugly form. So I'm going to type in a name, foo, and press submit. And so there's the first line of output, if we just go back and forth here a little bit. My first line of output is cat. Inside cat, that's the model attribute called cat. That's Sydney. And that is why we get the output Sydney. The next line of output, that's the toString of my inventory object. And then there's the individual values that I displayed. So remember on the next line, I went and said inventory item, and then I did the item ID, item name, quantity. So that's the next 2 lines of output in my browser right there. They're displayed with spaces because I use the paragraph element, as we should. And then the last thing is foo. That's actually the output from this line where I displayed the param.name, which was the input parameter. That was the request parameter. Cool. That technically means I probably didn't actually need the request param here, but we're going to use that later, so I left it in. But there you go. Now, this isn't typically how you would display these kinds of things, but this is just the beginning. We're just trying to get you used to creating or sending your data from the controller to the output page. It's all good. The other thing I want to do really quickly is just have a look at the source code. You can view source too, or you can view the elements. They're both worth looking at. But you'll notice that I just see the text inside the paragraph tags. That's all I see. There's no hint of any Thymeleaf here at all, which is good. That's the way it should be. Similarly, if I just do a quick view page source, same thing. All I see is the text. The Thymeleaf was processed on the server. The server built a text HTML response, and this is what it built. And this is what it sent back to the browser. So all you see is the text that the server created and added to the response body, because all the Thymeleaf stuff happens on the server side, not on the browser or the client side. So now that you know how to use and access model attributes, you're ready to start creating more interesting dynamic output pages using Thymeleaf. So we're going to start learning how to do that in the next video. Until then, thanks for watching.